I received a mysterious call that dragged me into the darkness of Central Park, where shadows and supernatural creatures lurk. Now, I'm part of a sinister legend that I can't escape. It all started with a call. Something so simple, so routine, that I didn't even imagine it would change my life. I was sitting at my desk, staring at a blank page of my computer, when the phone rang, interrupting the silence of the apartment. It was close to midnight, an hour when New York City begins to sink into an unsettling, almost supernatural calm. Only a few venture to walk the streets, and Central Park in particular becomes a place almost forgotten by most. The number on the screen was unknown, but something prompted me to answer. "Hello," I said, without much interest, waiting for a survey or a wrong call. "Are you a journalist?" "The one who works for the city newspaper." The voice was deep, raspy, as if it had been underwater for too long. I couldn't help but feel slightly uncomfortable, but I replied that yes, it was me. "I need you to come. It is urgent. Central Park, South Entrance, 3 a.m. You have to see it with your own eyes." The silence that followed was so heavy that it almost made me reconsider. I knew that these types of calls were usually pranks or attempts to get attention. But something in that voice, something kept me paying attention.
If you like this video, stay until the end, like, subscribe, and activate the bell for more videos.
The feeling that what they were telling me was real grew stronger. The clock read 1:30 a.m., and as I thought about whether or not I should go, my mind began to chart different paths. Was it a lie? A practical joke? Or something else? I decided to investigate. As a journalist, my job has always been to seek the truth, no matter how dark or disturbing it may be. I took my coat, left it on the chair, and without thinking much more, headed towards Central Park. The night was colder than usual. The street lights seemed to flicker, as if the wind was playing with them, and a thick fog was slowly beginning to descend on the city. As I approached the south entrance, the feeling of unease grew stronger. I wasn't sure what I expected to find, but there was something that drove me to keep going. When I arrived at the entrance, the image of the deserted park greeted me. The sound of my footsteps echoed against the pavement, and darkness seemed to swallow my every move. I looked at the clock. It was 2:45 a.m. There was still a quarter of an hour to go before the appointment, and as I waited, I couldn't help but feel that something wasn't right. The city has always had that peculiar atmosphere of a place full of life, but at the same time, oppressive, as if an invisible force were lurking. I walked slowly along the edge of the park, watching the empty benches, the shadows of the trees that stretched like skeletal fingers. Suddenly, a soft sound, like the rustling of dry leaves under the weight of something, or someone, made me stop. I looked around, but I didn't see anything. The wind rose, stirring the branches of the trees, and for a moment, I wondered if perhaps my imagination was playing with me. However, I couldn't ignore the growing feeling that something was there, watching me. At 3 a.m. sharp, the phone rang again. The same raspy voice, this time with a more urgent tone, spoke to me again. "You're almost there, right? There is no time to lose. If you come to the South Entrance, I'll show you what I've told you. But be careful. They're waiting for you, and they're not like the others." My muscles tensed. A twinge of fear ran down my spine. Who are they? I didn't know it, but I couldn't help but feel like I had crossed a line I shouldn't. Fear was beginning to surface, and although I knew I had to continue investigating, something inside me told me that this was not normal. I continued to advance towards the center of the park, following the directions of the voice, and soon I reached a more secluded area. The fog had increased, and the darkness seemed denser. At that moment, a chill ran through my body as I noticed something strange in the air. A presence, a shadow that seemed to move quickly between the trees, so thin that it could almost have been an illusion. I kept walking until a figure appeared in the shadows. He wasn't like an ordinary person. He was on his back, but the shape was too thin, and his posture so strange that I couldn't help but stop. The details of his figure were grim, as if something was wrong with his body. And the worst, something inside me told me that I shouldn't get any closer. The figure turned slowly, and I could see his face, or what was left of it. He was not human. The eyes were large, completely black, with no pupils. The skin, gray and decomposed, seemed to wrinkle as if it were about to fall to pieces. The face was a mass of burnt flesh, but the worst of all was the smile. A twisted smile, as if I was enjoying my fear. At that moment, my whole body reacted. The instinct of survival prompted me to take a step back, but the ground creaked beneath my feet, alerting the figure. I couldn't move. My heart was pounding, and my whole being was crying to flee, but terror kept me motionless. The figure raised a hand, pointing at me, and the shadows around seemed to move, getting closer and closer. The air became dense, heavy, and I felt my lungs tighten. Something was wrong. Something terrible was about to happen. The shadow watching me began to move towards me, taking slow but inevitable steps. It was as if the air around him was distorted, as if the world itself was leaning towards that figure. My body was paralyzed, unable to move, as if my whole being was caught in an invisible net. The fear I felt was so deep that I couldn't even think clearly. The figure took a step further, and it was then that the mist, which until that moment had been slowly spreading through the park, strangely concentrated around the creature. It seemed as if the fog enveloped her, as if she was receiving an energy from her, turning her even more real, more solid. My eyes tried to capture the image of the creature, but it was becoming more and more difficult. It was as if my mind began to refuse to accept what I was seeing. Suddenly, the creature raised its hand, pointing at me, and what happened next was something I can never forget. A low, almost imperceptible hum began to fill my ears, as if the whole environment began to emit a strange, incomprehensible frequency. The trees surrounding the park began to tremble. Their branches creaked as if they were going to break, and the shadows that danced on the ground lengthened, stretching beyond natural. Everything became darker, and the air became thick, as if it could be cut with a knife. That's when I heard a voice, even though it wasn't from the creature. It was not his voice, but something much deeper, something that seemed to come from the bowels of the earth itself. "We've been waiting for you." I couldn't move, I couldn't react. The words pierced me like lightning, and terror filled me completely. The figure in front of me didn't look so strange anymore. Its presence had intensified, as if the fog itself were absorbing it and giving it a more definite, more concrete shape. And at that moment I understood something. He was not alone. There wasn't just one creature. Had other, many more. My breathing became erratic as I looked around, trying to locate myself, to find a way out. But the shadows were already approaching, enveloping the place, as if they wanted to trap every corner, every space. The figure took a step closer to me, and the darkness around it seemed to take on a life of its own. The mist began to swirl in spirals around his body, as if it was some kind of elemental force feeding him. The creature's every move seemed to alter reality itself, as if it were undoing the rules of space and time. And then, as if everything was happening in slow motion, the shadows began to come off the trees. They were not normal shadows, not like the ones I have seen anywhere else in the world. These shadows had shapes, bodies, human figures, but they were not. They were distorted, their silhouettes so dark that they seemed not to reflect the light. And their eyes, if they could be called eyes, glowed with an eerie yellow light. They were sliding on the floor, towards me, without making a sound, but I could feel their presence, their threat. My mind tried to reason, to find some logical explanation, but I couldn't. What I was seeing didn't make sense. There was nothing in this world that could explain it. My survival instinct screamed at me that I should run, that I should get out of there, but my legs were not responding. Fear paralyzed me, and every step those figures took made me feel smaller, more vulnerable. The creature in front of me, with its twisted smile, raised both hands, and some sort of dark energy began to emanate from its body. I could feel it, as if it were an invisible pressure that crushed me, that took my breath away. The shadows around him began to move faster, and I felt as if everything around me was collapsing. I couldn't breathe, I couldn't think clearly. "We've been waiting for you," the voice repeated, louder and closer, as if coming from every corner of the park. and now you can't escape. At that moment, a shudder ran through my body. It wasn't just fear. It was something much deeper, something primitive. It was as if my soul itself was being dragged into something I couldn't comprehend. Something bigger than me, something that fed on my terror, on my despair. I tried to take a step back, but my feet didn't budge. I looked around, looking for any sign of hope, but the shadows were already completely around me. The fog, now thick and black, looked like a sea from which he could not get out. The trees leaned towards me, as if they wanted to catch me, and the sound of my breathing was the only thing I could hear at that moment, louder than ever. Suddenly, I felt a pressure in my chest, as if something was trying to take the air out of me. A figure, larger and darker than the others, appeared in front of me. His yellow eyes shone with excruciating intensity, and his mouth opened, revealing a smile that made my blood run cold. "You have found us," he said, his voice sounding like it came from the bottom of the abyss. "And now, there's no way you can leave anymore." The creature took a step towards me, and at that moment, I understood something that chilled me even more. I wasn't investigating. I wasn't looking for a story or a report. He was being hunted. The pressure in my chest increased, as if I was being crushed by an invisible hand. The creature in front of me, that mass of shadows and flesh, was getting closer and closer. His eyes shone with an unnatural glow, and the sound of his breathing mingled with the murmur of the mist. I could feel the air getting thicker, heavier, as if time itself was standing still, waiting for something I couldn't understand. I tried to move, but my legs were unresponsive. I was trapped, not only by the shadows around me, but by a paralyzing terror that consumed me from within. The figure stretched out a hand towards me, and a shudder ran through my entire body. It was not a friendly gesture. It was as if I was claiming something from me, something I couldn't give. "You've found us," he repeated, this time in a voice that resounded in my head, like a distant but close echo at the same time. "And now you're one of us." I didn't understand what he meant. One of them? What were they? What did he mean that I had found myself? It all seemed like a nightmare, one that I couldn't wake up. The shadows around me began to move, to glide across the ground like black snakes, getting closer and closer. Suddenly, the figure raised his hand, and a gust of icy wind hit my face. The trees around me began to creak, and the shadows seemed to creep toward the center of the park, gathering in a kind of dark vortex. Everything that was once tangible and familiar, the sound of the city in the distance, the cold night air, disappeared. Instead, there was only darkness. Darkness that engulfed everything. That's when the voice came back, louder than ever, echoing inside my head. "We've been waiting for you because you know something. You know what happened here. You know what's going on." A flood of memories washed over me. Blurry and fragmented images began to appear, as if my mind was trying to piece together something I had tried to forget. I remember that at some point, I researched urban legends in New York. Old stories about unexplained disappearances, people who had entered Central Park and never returned. Stories about fear-feeding entities, shadows lurking in the dark, waiting for someone to get too close. I'd heard of it, of course, but I'd never really believed it. It was just a legend, an old wives' tale to scare children. But now he understood. The shadows, the figures, the creatures around me were not a myth. They were real, and they were here in the same place as me. And I was his next target. On an impulse, my mind tried to find a way out. I didn't know how, I didn't know why, but something inside me screamed that I had to fight, that I had to get out of there. I looked back at the entrance to the park, but the fog had closed completely, like an impenetrable wall. The figure who had been staring at me with his empty eyes began to walk towards me. But instead of feeling me approaching, I felt that he was moving away. Not physically, not in the traditional sense. It was as if the creature was fading away, fading into the mist, but it wasn't leaving. It was as if my own perception of space and time was being distorted, as if the entire park was an illusion, a place between dimensions. "You can't escape," whispered the voice, now more distant, weaker, as if speaking to me from another plane. "The park has claimed you. You're already part of us." And then, A wave of darkness enveloped me completely. It wasn't a fainting or a loss of consciousness. It was as if my whole being had been absorbed by the same darkness that surrounded me. It was like a void, but filled with something indescribable, as if my soul was being swallowed by a force I couldn't comprehend. The last thing I remember is the feeling of falling. I was falling through an endless tunnel, swept away by the very darkness I had encountered, until suddenly I found myself back in the park. But it was not the same park. I couldn't explain it, but something had changed. Shadows no longer moved in a disorderly manner. Now, they seemed aligned, as if waiting for something or someone. As I looked around, I saw figures, faces, all watching me from the shadows, their yellow eyes glowing in the darkness. And then I understood the worst. He was not alone. There were others like me, trapped in this place, condemned to be part of the darkness, as part of that strange and malevolent force that inhabited Central Park. Suddenly, one last image formed in my mind. The face of the creature that had attacked me, smiling again. This time, however, his smile was different. It was a smile of triumph, as if he had finally won. "Welcome," said the voice in my mind. "Home." Now I understand what happened that night in Central Park. I thought it was going to be just another paranormal story, something I could tell in the newspaper and move on with my life. But it was not like that. That call, that date night, led me to an encounter with something beyond what any human being could comprehend. Those who disappeared, those who never returned, are now part of what lurks in the shadows. And now, I'm one of them too.